The Whispering Walls. In a forgotten corner of town, hidden by overgrown trees and crumbling walls, stood an abandoned building known only as the Brannon House. The structure, which had once been grand, now lay in ruin. Its broken windows seemed like hollow eyes, staring out at anyone who dared to come near. Stories floated through the town about strange noises and whispers in the night, and shadows that danced in the moonlight. It was said that the building had a dark history. Decades ago, it had been a place of life, bustling with activity and joy. But one fateful night, a fire swept through, taking the lives of its inhabitants and leaving nothing but charred walls and a deep, unspoken sadness. Now, the Brannon House was a place no one visited, except for those who were foolish enough to tempt fate. On a cold autumn evening, a group of friends, Emma, Liam, Sophia, and Jake, decided to explore the Brannon House. They had grown up hearing tales of the building's haunted history, and they were curious. That night, they gathered at the edge of the property, armed with flashlights and a growing sense of dread. "Are we really doing this?" Sophia asked, her voice trembling. Liam grinned, trying to lighten the mood. "Come on, Sophia. It's just an old building. Nothing's going to happen." But as they crossed the threshold, a chilling breeze swept through, and the door creaked open, almost as if it were welcoming them inside. The air inside was thick and musty. Dust covered every surface, and spider webs hung in the corners, like silent sentinels guarding secrets long buried. Their footsteps echoed as they walked, each step sounding louder than the last. They wandered through the rooms, shining their flashlights on faded wallpaper and broken furniture. But as they went deeper, they began to feel a strange pressure, as if the walls themselves were watching. In the dining room, they found a long, rotting table set for a meal, plates still placed as if waiting for guests to return. Emma ran her fingers over the table, feeling a chill crawl up her spine. "Why does it look like they just left?" she whispered. Liam shrugged. "Maybe it's all part of the story. People say they never left." As they moved to the second floor, the feeling of unease grew stronger. They heard faint sounds, scratches, whispers, and something like a low, distant hum. "Did you hear that?" Jake asked, his face pale. Sophia nodded, clutching his arm. "I think we should leave." But before they could decide, the door at the end of the hallway slammed shut with a deafening bang. They all froze, staring at the door. Liam took a shaky breath. "It's probably just the wind." Jake shook his head, his eyes wide. "The windows are broken, but there's no breeze. This is something else." Emma whispered, "Maybe it's them." They laughed nervously, but the laughter died as quickly as it came. The hallway grew colder, and suddenly, they heard soft, whispering voices. They couldn't make out the words, but the voices were persistent, echoing off the walls and filling the air with dread. "Let's go," Sophia said, her voice barely a whisper. But as they turned to leave, they saw a shadow at the end of the hall. It was dark and shapeless, yet it seemed to have a presence, a consciousness that watched them with malevolent intent. Emma shone her flashlight on it, but the light passed through, barely illuminating the shadow. The figure seemed to waver, shifting in and out of existence. Who are you?" Jake managed to stammer. The shadow didn't respond. Instead, it moved closer, its darkness stretching across the floor. The whispering grew louder, filling their minds with disorienting, broken words. "They took everything, the fire. It never ends." They backed away, stumbling as the whispers became screams, echoing through their heads. The walls seemed to close in, twisting and warping as if the house itself were alive. "Run!" Liam shouted, grabbing Sophia's hand. They turned and fled, racing down the stairs. The shadows chased them, filling the air with a suffocating darkness. The screams grew louder, mingling with sounds of fire and breaking glass. But as they reached the entrance, they found the door was gone, replaced by a solid wall. Panicked, they banged on the wall, shouting and screaming, but their voices were swallowed by the darkness. Emma looked around, tears streaming down her face. "We're trapped." And then they heard it. A voice, louder than the rest, cold and hollow. You will stay, forever. The darkness closed in, wrapping around them like tendrils. One by one, their screams faded into silence, becoming just another whisper among the many voices trapped within the walls of the Brannon house. The town didn't hear from the group of friends again. Days turned into weeks and then into months. Their families searched, posters were put up, and rescue teams scoured the area, but it was as if they had simply vanished. The only place no one dared to search thoroughly was the Brannon house. Some of the older residents whispered that the house had claimed them, just as it had claimed others before. Years later, a new family moved into town. Among them was a young man named Daniel, who, like many before him, heard rumors of the haunted house. Unlike most, however, Daniel was not the type to be easily frightened. He was a skeptic by nature, fascinated by the stories but convinced they were nothing more than tall tales. On a chilly autumn night, he decided to investigate the Brannon house on his own, determined to disprove the legends once and for all. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and a sense of confidence, Daniel approached the decrepit structure. The house loomed before him, dark and silent, with an aura that seemed to chill the very air around it. He pushed open the front door, which groaned as it swung inward, and stepped inside. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the soft creak of the floorboards under his feet. Daniel walked through the rooms, taking in the decaying furniture and peeling wallpaper. He noted the strange sense of familiarity in each room, as though the house had been waiting for him, remembering him. When he reached the dining room, Daniel froze. The table was set, just as it had been on that fateful night with Emma, Liam, Sophia, and Jake. The plates and silverware were covered in dust, but there was something unsettlingly lifelike about the arrangement, as though someone had left it untouched for years. "Who set this table?" he murmured to himself as if in response. A whisper floated through the air. It was faint, almost too quiet to hear, but it sent a chill down Daniel's spine. He held his flashlight steady, pointing it toward the source of the sound, but saw nothing. Then he heard it again. "Forever?" The voice whispered, barely audible but unmistakably real. He stepped back, suddenly gripped by a feeling of dread. As he moved, his flashlight illuminated a series of framed photographs on the wall. They were old, black and white images, their edges yellowed with time. He leaned in to get a closer look, and his breath caught in his throat. Staring back at him from the photographs were the faces of 4 young people. He recognized them instantly, the same faces he had seen on the missing posters that were still tacked up around town, faded and forgotten. Emma, Liam, Sophia, and Jake. Their expressions were haunting, as though they were aware of the dark fate that awaited them. Daniel's hands shook as he realized the truth. They had become part of the house, trapped forever in its walls. Just then, he heard footsteps behind him. He spun around, his flashlight casting erratic beams of light across the darkened room. Shadows danced across the walls, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw faces in the darkness. Familiar faces, watching him with hollow eyes. "Daniel?" The voice was soft, almost pleading, and it echoed from the far end of the room. Trembling, he followed the sound, his mind racing. The voice was familiar, and as he got closer, he felt an overwhelming sense of sorrow. Then he saw her. Standing in the doorway was a figure, pale, translucent, and undeniably real. It was Emma. Her face was filled with sadness, her eyes wide and empty, as though she was reaching out to him from somewhere beyond. "Emma?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. She didn't answer, but her eyes spoke volumes. She lifted a hand, reaching out to him, and for a brief moment, Daniel felt a connection. A bridge between the living and the dead. He felt her pain, her fear, her desperation to escape the dark fate that had bound her to the house. But then, just as quickly as she appeared, Emma vanished, her form dissolving into the shadows. The room grew colder, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. They filled the air, each voice layered on top of the other, a cacophony of despair and longing. "Help us! Help us!" Daniel backed away, his mind spinning. He wanted to leave, to run, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had to do something, that he had been brought here for a reason. Taking a deep breath, he turned back toward the hallway, his resolve hardening. "I'm going to help you," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if they could hear him as he moved deeper into the house. The walls seemed to shift, twisting and warping as though alive. The shadows thickened, coalescing into dark shapes that followed him, watching his every move. He could feel their presence, their sorrow and anger, pressing down on him, but he pushed forward. In the heart of the house, he found a small, hidden room, its door cracked open just enough for him to see inside. He stepped through the doorway and felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over him. The walls were covered in strange symbols, etched into the wood with what looked like fingernails. A faint, smoky haze filled the room, and in the center stood an old, dusty mirror. As he approached the mirror, he saw his own reflection, but there was something wrong. His face looked hollow, almost ghostly, and behind him, he could see the faces of the four friends, their expressions filled with desperation. "You can't leave, not without us?" The voices filled his head, and the mirror began to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. He felt himself being drawn in, as though the mirror was pulling him into its depths, binding him to the same fate as those before him. With a final burst of strength, he broke away, stumbling back from the mirror. The house seemed to roar in fury, the walls vibrating as the shadows closed in, angry that he was resisting. But then he remembered Emma's face, the sorrow in her eyes, and he knew he couldn't leave them behind. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, using its screen to reflect light onto the mirror. "I release you," he shouted, his voice echoing through the room. The mirror shattered, pieces of glass flying across the room, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, slowly, the house began to change. The shadows lifted, the whispers faded, and the air grew lighter, as though a dark weight had been lifted. Daniel felt a warmth wash over him, and in that moment, he knew they were free. He staggered out of the house, his legs weak, his heart pounding. Behind him, the Brannon house stood silent and empty, its walls finally at peace. As he walked away, he thought he heard a faint whisper on the wind, a soft, grateful thank you. And for the first time in decades, the Brannon house was truly abandoned.